Border wall components are on the selling block. Reports say the Pentagon is quietly selling off millions of dollars in building materials. That's to make good on Biden's pledge to halt former President Trump's signature project.
Multiple outlets report that DoD's logistics agency is auctioning off border wall materials. The sales reportedly took place on GovPlanet, an online auction house specializing in military surplus. Since April, the website sold 81 lots of steel square structural tubes for about $2 million. 13 more lots will come up this and next Wednesday. Steel tubes like these were meant for panels in Trump's U.S.-Mexico border wall. The former president spent $15 billion on the project to ward off illegal border crossings. During his presidency, 450 miles were built, with another 250 miles in the works. Biden called off construction immediately upon taking office, despite paying hefty storage fees for unused wall parts. The actions came after a bill called the Finish It Act cleared the Senate. The legislation would force the materials to be used for border wall construction. That's as unprecedented numbers of illegal immigrants swamp the borders and make their way into cities like New York. Senator Tom Cotton, co-sponsor of the Finish It Act, condemned what he called a fire sale. He told the New York Post that the Biden administration is leaving the border open to terrorists while selling border security materials at a loss. It's unclear how much money from the sales went into the Pentagon's budget. According to the New York Post, citing a lieutenant colonel, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has disposed of over $150 million worth of border wall materials. That's over half of a total stockpile worth about $260 million.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is responding to a leaked debate strategy memo. He told Fox News that the document doesn't belong to him.
On the memo, it's not mine. I haven't read it, and it's just, I think it's something that we haven't put off to the side.
The memo in question came from the Never Back Down Political Action Committee. It suggested that the Florida governor defend former President Trump at the GOP primary debate in Wisconsin this Wednesday. It also told DeSantis to target Vivek Ramaswamy, a GOP candidate who has surged in the polls in recent months. A recent Emerson poll showed the two tied at 10% each, trailing President Trump's 56% approval rating. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem says she would consider becoming Trump's vice presidential running mate. Noem told Fox News last week that anyone being asked to do so should consider it as a service to the country.
I think everybody should consider it. Our country is breaking right in front of our very eyes today, and everybody should be a part of putting it back on its foundation. And if President Trump is going to be back in the White House, I do all I can to help him be successful.
Noem is a two-term governor and former four-term congresswoman. She said in another interview that she wouldn't consider running for president, citing the depth of the field and the strength of the frontrunners. Many of Noem's views are close to Trump's. Meanwhile, Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley dismissed the idea of being vice president for Trump. FEMA has warned that its disaster funds could dry up within weeks and delay federal response to natural disasters. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says there were 15 weather-related disaster events this year before August 8th, with each causing more than $1 billion in damage. That total doesn't include the recent wildfires on Maui, which caused an estimated $6 billion in damage to the Lahaina area. And the peak of hurricane season is not until mid-September. President Biden recently asked Congress for $12 billion in funding to replenish FEMA's disaster fund. FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell said even that money may not be enough and would only cover some of the immediate needs to get through this fiscal year. Democrat candidates are honing in on South Carolina. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is making numerous stops there. The party is having its first primary in South Carolina on February 3rd, switching from the traditional Iowa. Here to discuss the latest in Kennedy's campaign is Epoch Times reporter Jeff Louderback. Jeff is speaking with Kennedy today and is following his campaign in the Peach State. Jeff Louderback, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Jeff, what's the significance of South Carolina to Kennedy's campaign?
Well, in New Hampshire and Iowa, the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, earlier this year decided to make South Carolina the first primary. New Hampshire and Iowa, for years, that's been the tradition that the caucus in one state and the primary in the other lead off the primary / caucus season. But Biden lost, President Biden lost New Hampshire last time, and he wanted South Carolina. He encouraged the DNC to start the primary season with South Carolina because he won it handily. So, yeah, a little favoritism going on there, but South Carolina is critical for the Democratic primary, and Kennedy knows that he needs to win South Carolina.
And what's Kennedy's message to voters there?
Well, he's had a message since he entered the race back in April of unity. He's refused to. He's criticized President Biden's agenda, but he hasn't criticized President Biden personally. The same with President Trump. He has talked about what he agrees and disagrees with President Trump on, but he doesn't go there as far as personal attacks. And that his philosophy is to bridge the gap. He talks about continuing his father's tradition, of course, his father being Robert F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1968. He wants to continue that tradition of unifying the country.
Now, Kennedy has garnered a wide range of support from voters that are, Democrats, conservatives, libertarians, as well as moderates. Why this wide range support?
Well, if you listen to him, he articulates his points with backing up with information and data, whether you agree with them or not. And he's not afraid to, he's obviously known for his stances against the safety and mandates for COVID vaccines. So that appeals to Republicans. It's interesting because I was at a town hall in Florence, South Carolina yesterday. I talked to three people. One was a 29-year-old woman who worked on the Trump campaign back in 2020 in South Carolina, and now she's volunteering for RFK Jr. And I talked to a man who was a Biden voter back in 2020 in South Carolina who's voting for RFK.
Now, Jeff, the DNC has threatened to sanction New Hampshire over the order in which states vote in the primaries. Can you explain that conflict to us and how the outcome of that conflict could affect Kennedy's primary results?
Well, the DNC voted to have South Carolina lead off the primary season. Iowa and New Hampshire, the Democratic leaders in that state, so far have refused. They say they're going to have the primary as planned because it's state law that they have their primary then. And so they're not concerned. They say they're not concerned about sanctions. I'm not sure about the deadline for Iowa, but the DNC set September 1st as the deadline for New Hampshire. At this point, they say they're going to hold the Democratic primary as planned, but President Biden likely won't be on the ballot in Iowa and New Hampshire if that takes place. And so that opens the door for RFK Jr. to win there in those primary. One's a caucus, one's a primary. So it opens the door for RFK Jr. to win there.
All right, Epoch Times reporter Jeff Louderback, thank you.
Thank you.
Hunter Biden's lawyers once said they would have his president dad take the witness stand in defense of his son. The statement referred to Hunter's gun charges. The statement was found in documents obtained by Politico. It was in a 32-page letter that Hunter's former attorney, Chris Clark, sent to prosecutors. Hunter faces charges for purchasing a gun while being addicted to cocaine. It appears that Clark was attempting to use the threat of President Biden's testimony to keep the Justice Department from prosecuting Hunter. He sent the letter just after news leaked that the Justice Department had enough evidence to indict Hunter. And he said if the president gave testimony, it would result in a constitutional crisis. Clark left Hunter's defense team last week. It's not clear if his departure is related to the document leak. COVID-19 may contribute to high blood pressure. New research has found a correlation in patients. Scientists looked at thousands of COVID-19 patients from 2020 to 2022. All of them were from the Bronx borough of New York City. None of them had a history of hypertension before the infection, but 6 months after their illness, some of them did. About 20% of people who were hospitalized with COVID developed high blood pressure, and about 10% of the patients who were diagnosed with COVID but not hospitalized also did. The hospitalized patients were twice as likely to develop high blood pressure than those who were hospitalized for the flu. Scientists are unsure how COVID might trigger hypertension.